Blood stained the parched earth of Wyoming Territory as Samuel Holloway lay dying beneath the merciless August sun of 1878. The outlaws who'd ambushed him had taken everything: his horse, his supplies, and soon, they thought, his life. Night fell across the prairie as Samuel's consciousness ebbed and flowed like the distant rivers he'd never see again. Abigail Anderson never intended to venture out after sunset. Living alone on her small homestead since her father's passing had taught her caution, but when her prized mare broke free from the corral, she had no choice. Carrying a brass lantern that cast long shadows across the tall grass, she followed the hoofprints until the light revealed something unexpected: not her horse, but a man sprawled face down in the dirt, his body barely moving with shallow breaths. "Hello," she called out, approaching cautiously. "Mister, can you hear me?" When she turned him over, Abigail gasped at the sight of his blood-soaked shirt and the ugly gash across his forehead. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with pain. "Water," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. Abigail hesitated only a moment before making her decision. She couldn't leave him to die. Setting down her lantern, she tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the worst of his wounds. "Stay with me," she urged. "I need to get you to shelter." The journey back to her homestead was arduous. Samuel was a large man, and though he tried to help by supporting some of his weight, he was too weak to walk properly. Abigail's mare had returned home of her own accord, which proved a blessing as Abigail managed to get Samuel onto the horse's back while she led them through the darkness, guided only by her lantern's glow. By the time they reached her small cabin, Samuel was unconscious again. With strength born of desperation, Abigail somehow maneuvered him inside and onto her bed. Through the night, she cleaned his wounds: a bullet graze along his ribs, knife cuts on his arms, and the head wound that worried her most. "Don't you die on me, stranger," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "Not after I went to all this trouble." Samuel's fever broke just before dawn. His eyes opened, clearer than before, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on Abigail, who had fallen asleep in a chair beside the bed. "Am I dead?" he asked, his voice rough with thirst. Abigail startled awake, relief washing over her face. "Not for lack of trying, I suspect." She helped him drink water, then explained how she'd found him. "Those wounds weren't from a fall. Someone tried to kill you." Samuel's expression darkened. "The Blackwell Gang. 5 of them ambushed me near Cottonwood Creek. They took my horse, my guns, even my boots." His hand moved to his side, wincing at the pain. "I played dead after the first shot. Guess they believed it." "You're lucky they did," Abigail said, mixing herbs into a paste for his wounds. "I'm Abigail Anderson. This is my homestead." "Samuel Holloway. Most folks call me Sam." He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "I'm obliged to you, Miss Anderson. You saved my life." "You can thank me by not dying in my bed," she replied pragmatically. "Rest now. We'll figure out the rest later." Over the following days, Abigail tended to Samuel's wounds with the skill of someone who'd lived without doctors nearby. She learned he was a former cavalry soldier turned cattle driver, making his way from Texas to Montana when the Blackwell Gang attacked him. "They're wanted in 3 territories," Samuel explained on the 3rd day when he was strong enough to sit up and eat proper food. "Their leader, Victor Blackwell, has a particular hatred for anyone who served in the Union Army." "And you did?" Abigail asked, serving him a bowl of stew. Samuel nodded. 4 years. Came west after the war ended looking for something different. His eyes met hers. "What about you? It's unusual to find a woman homesteading alone." Abigail's expression grew distant. "My father and I came from Pennsylvania 5 years ago." He died last winter pneumonia. The neighbors expected me to sell the place and move to town, find a husband." Her chin lifted slightly. "I decided otherwise." Samuel studied her with new appreciation. She was pretty in a natural way, honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical braid, clear blue eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were strong but gentle when tending his wounds. "You're braver than most men I know," he said sincerely. "Not brave." "Just stubborn," she replied, but a flush colored her cheeks. By the end of the week, Samuel could walk short distances. He insisted on helping with chores, though Abigail protested he should rest. "I can't lie abed while you do everything," he said firmly, limping out to the porch where she was mending harness leather. "Besides, I'm putting you at risk. If the Blackwells realize I survived, they might come looking." "Then we should get you well enough to travel," Abigail said practically, though the thought of him leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Samuel turned to her. "Why did you help me? You could have left me out there, most would have." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "My mother died when I was young. My father always said that in a land as hard as this, kindness is what keeps us human." She looked down at her hands. "And I guess I know what it's like to be alone when trouble comes." The understanding between them deepened that night. As the weeks passed, Samuel's strength returned. He began taking on more responsibilities around the homestead, repairing the barn roof that had leaked all summer, reinforcing the corral fence, and chopping enough firewood to last through winter. Abigail found herself watching him as he worked, admiring not just his physical strength, but the quiet determination with which he approached every task. She'd known other men, neighboring homesteaders, who'd called on her after her father died, ostensibly to help but really to assess her vulnerability. Samuel was different. He never presumed, never overstepped. For Samuel, Abigail was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his travels. She was neither the delicate city girl nor the hardened frontier woman, but something altogether more complex, fierce in her independence, yet capable of great tenderness. He found himself inventing reasons to stay another day, then another. One evening in early September, as they sat shelling peas on the porch, Samuel finally spoke of what had been weighing on his mind. "I need to go to town soon, report what happened, see if the sheriff has heard anything about the Blackwell Gang's whereabouts." Abigail's hand stilled. "Of course. You've been well enough to travel for some time now. I'll need to borrow your mare if you're willing. I promise to bring her back." He paused. "And then I should probably move on." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. "Where will you go?" Abigail asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I still have that job waiting in Montana, if I can get there before winter sets in." Samuel looked out across the land that was beginning to feel like home. "Unless there's a reason to stay." Abigail met his eyes, then quickly looked away. "You should do what's best for you, Samuel. I've managed on my own before." The following morning, Samuel borrowed Abigail's mare and rode to the nearest town, Promise Creek, a half-day's journey from the homestead. The settlement was little more than a dusty main street lined with essential businesses: general store, livery stable, saloon, and a small sheriff's office. Sheriff Thomas Calloway was a grizzled veteran of both the Mexican War and the more recent conflict between North and South. He listened to Samuel's account of the ambush with a grave expression. "The Blackwells have been terrorizing folks all across the territory," he confirmed, offering Samuel coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long on the stove. "Last I heard, they robbed the stage near Fort Laramie. Killed the driver. Any posse going after them?" Samuel asked. The sheriff snorted. "With what men? I'm the only law for 50 miles, and most able-bodied men are either working their claims or moved on after the gold played out." He eyed Samuel speculatively. "You said you were cavalry." "That's right, 4th Illinois. I could use a deputy," Sheriff Calloway said bluntly. "Pays not much, but it's steady. Might even come with a room above the jailhouse." Samuel considered the offer. It would mean staying in the territory, close to Abigail. Yet it would also put him directly in the path of the Blackwells when they inevitably returned to the area. "Let me think on it," he said finally. Before leaving town, Samuel visited the general store. With the last of the money he'd kept hidden in his boot money the Outlaws had missed, he purchased supplies for Abigail's homestead. Coffee, sugar, and a bolt of blue calico he thought would match her eyes. The storekeeper wrapped his purchases, commenting, "You staying out at the Anderson place, I hear. That girl needs someone looking after her. Shame about her father." "Miss Anderson seems quite capable of looking after herself," Samuel replied coolly, not liking the man's tone. The storekeeper raised his eyebrows. "Maybe so, but winter's coming. That's no time for a woman to be alone out there." On the ride back, Samuel pondered his future. The deputy position would provide security, a chance to bring the Blackwells to justice, and a reason to remain near Abigail. But it would also mean danger not just for him, but potentially for her as well. Abigail was in the garden when he returned, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before frost claimed them. She straightened when she heard the horse approach, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "How was town?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands as he dismounted. "Informative," Samuel replied, unpacking the supplies. When he handed her the calico, her eyes widened with surprise. "Samuel, you shouldn't have spent your money on me. Consider it partial payment for saving my life." He hesitated. "The sheriff offered me a job as deputy." Abigail's expression betrayed nothing. "That's a good position, respectable. It would mean staying in Promise Creek." "Yes, I suppose it would." She folded the fabric carefully, not meeting his eyes. "Will you take it?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming fast toward the homestead, trailing dust in the golden light of the setting sun. Samuel's hand instinctively went to his hip, but he no longer had a gun. "Get inside," he told Abigail urgently. "Lock the door." "I'm not leaving you out here unarmed," she protested, then ran not into the house but toward the barn. She returned moments later with a shotgun, just as the riders drew up to the yard. Samuel stepped forward, positioning himself between Abigail and the strangers. Relief flooded him when he recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Calloway. The other 2 men were locals he'd seen in town. "Holloway," the sheriff called, dismounting stiffly. "Thought I'd find you here. We've got trouble." He nodded respectfully to Abigail. "Miss Anderson." "What kind of trouble?" Samuel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Blackwell Gang was spotted 10 miles south of here. They hit the Watson farm this morning, took horses, supplies." The sheriff's face darkened. "And they killed old man Watson when he tried to stop them." Abigail gasped softly behind him. Samuel felt cold anger settling in his gut. "How many?" "All 5 of them. We're gathering men for a posse. Thought you might want in, considering they left you for dead." Sheriff Calloway glanced at the shotgun in Abigail's hands. "Though I see you might be otherwise occupied." Samuel looked back at Abigail, saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, he realized, but for him. "When do you ride out?" he asked. "Dawn tomorrow. Meet at the sheriff's office." Calloway mounted his horse. "Don't wait too long deciding about that deputy position, Holloway. I need good men." After the sheriff and his companions departed, silence stretched between Samuel and Abigail. "You're going after them," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. I have to. If not for what they did to me, then for Watson." He moved closer to her. But I'll come back, Abigail, if you want me to. Her grip tightened on the shotgun. You can't promise that, not if you're hunting men like the Blackwells. No, he admitted. I can't promise it, but I can promise that if I live, I'll return to you. Abigail studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, decisively. Then I'll be here waiting. That night they sat closer than usual at dinner, the knowledge of his imminent departure hanging between them. As Samuel helped her clear the dishes, their hands touched, lingered. Samuel, Abigail said softly, I don't want you to go without knowing. She faltered, then straightened her shoulders. Without knowing that I care for you, more than I should, perhaps, for someone I've known so briefly. The simplicity of her declaration moved him deeply. Samuel took her hands in his. I've crossed half this country, Abigail, and never found a place that felt like home until I woke up in your cabin. He drew her closer. I'll come back to you. That's a promise I intend to keep. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with a passion that matched his own. For a few precious hours, they forgot about outlaws and posses, about the dangers that awaited beyond the homestead's boundaries. There was only the two of them, finding in each other something neither had expected to discover in this harsh territory. Dawn came too quickly. Samuel rose before first light, dressed silently so as not to wake Abigail, but she was already up, preparing food for his journey. The sheriff will have a spare pistol, she told him, handing him a package wrapped in oilcloth. But I want you to take this as well. Inside was a hunting knife with a bone handle, well used but meticulously maintained. It was my father's, Abigail explained. He always said it saved his life more than once. Samuel strapped the knife to his belt, deeply touched by the gesture. I'll take good care of it. Take good care of yourself, she replied, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. As promised, Sheriff Calloway provided Samuel with a revolver and ammunition. The posse consisted of 12 men, most of them ranchers and homesteaders with personal grievances against the Blackwell Gang. They rode south, following the trail the outlaws had left behind deliberately, Samuel suspected. They're too experienced to leave such obvious signs, he told the sheriff as they examined fresh hoofprints near a creek. They want us to follow them. Could be an ambush, Calloway agreed. But what choice do we have? Let them continue terrorizing the territory. For 3 days, they tracked the gang through increasingly rugged terrain. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they found themselves in a narrow canyon with steep walls rising on either side, perfect territory for an ambush. Samuel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Sheriff, we need to turn back, he warned. This is exactly what they want. Before Calloway could respond, gunfire erupted from the ridges above. 2 men fell immediately. Samuel dove from his horse, dragging the sheriff with him behind a boulder as bullets kicked up dust around them. It's the Blackwells. Someone shouted unnecessarily as more gunfire rained down. Samuel peered around the boulder, spotted movement on the ridge, and fired carefully. A cry of pain told him he'd hit his target. The battle continued for nearly an hour, with the posse pinned down but gradually picking off the outlaws' advantage through better shooting. Finally, the firing from above ceased. 4 members of the Blackwell Gang lay dead or wounded. Victor Blackwell himself, recognizable by his distinctive red beard, had escaped on horseback through a hidden trail at the far end of the canyon. The posse had lost 3 men, with 4 others wounded. Samuel helped tend to the injuries as best he could, using skills learned during the war. We need to get these men to a doctor, he told Sheriff Calloway. And someone needs to go after Blackwell. The sheriff, nursing a bullet graze on his arm, nodded grimly. Take 2 men and track him. The rest of us will get the wounded back to town. Samuel chose the two best riders from among the uninjured posse members. They followed Blackwell's trail northward, realizing with growing alarm that he was heading directly toward Promise Creek and beyond that, Abigail's homestead. "He's making for the territorial border," suggested one of the men riding with Samuel. "If he crosses into Dakota Territory, he's beyond our jurisdiction." But Samuel feared something else entirely. If Blackwell recognized him as the man who'd survived his attack, he might seek revenge on anyone associated with him, including Abigail. They rode hard through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By midday, they caught sight of Blackwell's dust on the horizon. The outlaw was indeed heading toward Promise Creek, but as they drew closer to town, he veered east directly toward Abigail's homestead. Samuel's blood ran cold. "He knows," he said to his companions. "Somehow he knows where to find me." Pushing their horses to the limit, they closed the distance, but Blackwell still maintained a lead. As they crested a hill, Samuel saw smoke rising in the distance from the direction of Abigail's farm. "No," he whispered, driving his exhausted horse forward with renewed desperation. When they reached the homestead, Samuel's worst fears seemed realized. The barn was ablaze, flames leaping high into the autumn sky. Blackwell's horse was tethered outside, but there was no sign of the outlaw or Abigail. Samuel dismounted, drawing his pistol. "Check the outbuildings," he ordered the other men. "I'll take the house." Moving cautiously toward the cabin, Samuel heard voices inside Blackwell's threatening growl and, to his profound relief, Abigail's defiant responses. He positioned himself beside the door, listening. "Tell me where Holloway is and I might let you live," Blackwell was saying. "I told you he rode out with the posse. I don't know where they went," Abigail replied, her voice admirably steady. "Don't lie to me, woman." "The storekeeper in town said Holloway's been staying here, playing house with you while recovering from wounds my men gave him." Samuel silently cursed the storekeeper's loose tongue. He peered through the window and saw Blackwell holding Abigail at gunpoint in the middle of the room. Her hands were bound, but she stood tall, showing no fear despite the danger. Making his decision, Samuel kicked open the door, his gun aimed at Blackwell's head. "Let her go, Victor. It's me you want." The outlaw spun around, dragging Abigail in front of him as a shield. "Well, if it ain't the dead man himself," Blackwell sneered. "Thought we'd finished you proper." "Your men were careless," Samuel replied, his eyes locked on Blackwell's. He was acutely aware of Abigail's life hanging in the balance. "Let her go. This is between you and me." "I think not," Blackwell said, pressing his gun to Abigail's temple. "Drop your weapon or I paint the wall with her brains." Samuel hesitated, then slowly bent to place his pistol on the floor. As he straightened, Abigail caught his eye, giving him an almost imperceptible nod. In that moment, he understood her plan. "Kick it over here," Blackwell ordered. Instead of complying, Samuel stood perfectly still. "You know I was cavalry, Blackwell, 4th Illinois. We fought at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Atlanta. I've killed better men than you." "Yet here you stand, unarmed," Blackwell laughed. "Your military days are long behind you, Holloway." "Maybe so," Samuel agreed, "but I learned one thing that served me well." He paused. "Always have a backup plan." At that precise moment, Abigail drove her elbow hard into Blackwell's ribs and dropped to the floor. Samuel lunged forward, drawing Abigail's father's knife from his belt in one fluid motion. Before Blackwell could recover, Samuel buried the blade in the outlaw's shoulder, causing him to drop his gun with a howl of pain. Samuel knocked Blackwell to the ground, retrieving his own pistol and training it on the wounded man. "It's over, Victor." Outside, Samuel's companions had secured the homestead and managed to extinguish the barn fire before it consumed the entire structure. They bound Blackwell's wounds, then tied him securely to take him back to Promise Creek to face justice. When the others had gone outside to prepare for the journey, Samuel turned to Abigail, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then surprised him by throwing her arms around him. "I knew you would come," she whispered against his chest. Samuel held her tightly, his heart pounding with the realization of how close he'd come to losing her. "I promised I would." They stood like that for a long moment before Abigail pulled back to look at him. "Did you find all of them, the Blackwell Gang?" "All but one," Samuel replied. "But he won't be troubling anyone ever again. The territory will be safer now." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sheriff Calloway still wants me as his deputy." "And what do you want, Samuel Holloway?" Abigail asked softly. Samuel looked around the cabin at the home Abigail had created, at the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. "I want to build something that lasts," he said honestly. "Something worth fighting for." Abigail smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then I suggest you start by helping me rebuild that barn." 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Abigail Anderson became Abigail Holloway in a small ceremony at Promise Creek's newly constructed church. Sheriff Calloway stood as Samuel's best man, while the wives of neighboring homesteaders attended Abigail. Samuel divided his time between his duties as deputy in town and working the homestead with Abigail. Together, they expanded the farm, adding cattle and more acreage. The territory was changing rapidly. The railroad would arrive within a year, bringing more settlers and opportunities. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the sunset, Samuel presented Abigail with a brass lantern, polished to a high shine. "What's this for?" she asked, turning it in her hands. "To remind us both of that night you found me," he explained. "If you hadn't been out looking for your horse, if you hadn't held that lantern over me." Abigail leaned against his shoulder. "I think about that sometimes. How different life would be if I had stayed inside that night." "Some might call it chance," Samuel said, his arm around her, "but I call it providence." They hung the lantern by the door where its light would guide them home in the darkest nights. In years to come, they would tell their children the story of how their lives had intersected on a moonless evening when death seemed certain and hope a distant dream. The Wyoming Territory grew and changed around them, eventually becoming a state. The wild frontier gradually yielded to civilization, but the legacy of those who had carved their homes from the wilderness lived on in the stories they passed down. And always, in the Holloway household, a lantern burned by the door, a beacon of the love that had begun when Abigail held it over a man left for dead, illuminating not just his face, but the path their lives would take together.